Hey everybody, it's 9 o'clock and 9 o'clock is with me, Father Warner. Today is really a wonderful teaching and I hope you share this with your friends, your family. We are in Saturday of the second week of Easter and our text is taken from John chapter 6 verses 16 to 21. I'm going to read the text and I've entitled today's teaching, Is Your Voice Recognition Turned On? So let's read the text. When evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, got into a boat and started across the sea to Capernaum. It was now dark and Jesus had not yet come to them. The sea became rough because a strong wind was blowing. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and coming near the boat, and they were terrified. But he said to them, "It is I, do not be afraid." They wanted to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the land towards which they were going. My dear friends, some time ago, you would remember that I wrote an article on, do we know that God is really speaking to us? Do we know this? Now, the Gospel of John addresses this topic in both direct and subtle ways. You know, Jesus is emphatic when he says in John chapter 10 verse 27, he says, "My sheep hear my voice and I know them and they follow me." Now, we know it is this voice that Mary of Magdala recognized at the Easter garden when Christ called her by name, and she, recognizing his voice, called him Rabboni. Till this point, we are told she thinks that he is the gardener, and then he calls out to her, she recognizes his voice. You know, the text of today has Jesus encountering the disciples in a storm on the Lake of Galilee. And like Mary, they too are terrified, for they think he is a ghost until he speaks to them and they recognize his voice when he says, "It is I, do not be afraid." You know, while we hear the comforting voice of God and recognize it, we must also confess to hearing the discomforting voice of God. Let me give an example. In the book of Genesis, in chapter 3, verse 8, speaking of the sin of Adam and Eve, it says, "Then they heard the voice of God walking in the garden towards evening." They knew they had done wrong, and they heard it in the voice of God. You know, yet, my dear friends, there are those who do not want to hear or recognize his voice, no matter what the tone of his voice may be. They simply choose to reject it. As Jesus told Pontius Pilate, "Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice." So, we live in a world today of voice recognition. You know, voice or speaker recognition is the ability of a machine like your cell phone or the ability of a program to receive and interpret dictation or to understand and perform spoken commands. So think about this. If a machine is clever enough to recognize our voice and obey it, then how much more do we owe God when he desires us to hear his voice and to obey it? So you might ask, what's with voice recognition and this reflection? You know, the end of chapter 4 finds Jesus in Galilee in the Gospel of John. Then in chapter 5, Jesus moves to Jerusalem. Chapter 6, from where our text is taken, has Jesus moving back to Galilee. In chapter 7, Jesus will return to Jerusalem. Now, we are in chapter 6, and that here we are told that the disciples get into a boat, row for about 3 or 4 miles on the Sea of Galilee. Now, Matthew and Mark tell us that Jesus made or he compelled, the Greek word is anankazo, he compelled his disciples to get into the boat. Read Mark chapter 6 verse 45. Why? Perhaps he saw that they were being infected with the crowd's excitement. Remember, he has just multiplied the bread and the crowd is excited. Jesus compels his disciples in the Gospel of Mark and Matthew to get into the boat. Now, we are also told in the Gospel of John that it was dark. You know, John uses dark or darkness 9 times in his Gospel. In John's Gospel, darkness is more than the absence of physical light. It signals evil, it signals danger. It is now dark and Jesus is absent. He has asked them to get into the boat. He is absent. Jesus has not yet come to them when the sea, we are told, becomes rough and a strong wind begins to blow. Now, look carefully in John's Gospel. There is no indication yet that the disciples are in danger. It's just that there is a strong wind. But what is clear is that the journey that they were going to have was not going to be easy. And it is this unsettling moment, in this unsettling moment, that they see Jesus. He is walking on the sea and he's coming near the boat, and it is now that they are terrified. We see this in verse 19 of today's text. Now, if you read the Synoptic Gospels, that's Matthew, Mark, and Luke, if you read the Synoptic Gospels, it tells us that the disciples are afraid because they think that Jesus is a ghost. Now, the Sea of Galilee, if you ever go there, is about 13 kilometers literally east to west and about 21 kilometers north to south. The point that is being made here, that they rowed 3 miles, that the disciples were somewhere in the middle of the lake. They have come to the middle of the lake, and they have come in the middle of a potential storm. So they have rowed a considerable distance in the storm, but have a considerable distance left to go. Now, when you think of who was in the boat, their group included very experienced fishermen, Simon Peter, Andrew, James, John. They have been on this lake many times during a storm. Yet, it is not the storm that they are afraid of in the Gospel of John. It is Jesus who they think is a ghost. You know, my friends, so many fears we face are not the ones that actually surround us, but the ones that we create in our head. And then it is in the storm that Jesus speaks. What does he say? Do not be afraid. It is I. Here, on the chaos of these troubled waters, Jesus is revealing himself on 2 levels. One, that he is the leader whom the disciples have been following, but he is also the presence of God in their midst. He comes to help them in their distress, as he does for you and me. Now, mercifully, they recognize his voice and they invite him into the boat, and immediately, watch, in the other Gospels the wind drops, the storm drops, but here immediately the boat reached land towards which they were going. You see, as I said, the Gospel in John does not mention that the storm has subsided, but simply that once they recognized his voice in the storm and invited him in, he saw them to their destination. And that is a beautiful lesson for us to learn. And that's the reason why, my friends, you need to read the Gospels. I keep saying, read it, read it, read it, because you notice that there are these beautiful details, differences, but beautiful details, as we see here in the Gospel of John. The wind doesn't drop, the storm doesn't drop, they reach their destination. Once they recognize Jesus and invite him into their boat, he sees them to the end of that storm. Now, Jesus has spoken. Jesus is speaking, and I want to show you that Jesus will continue to speak in and to our modern world. We can be sure of that. The question is not, are people hearing his voice today? Are people hearing the voice of Jesus today? Of course, that is a given. Everyone hears the voice of God. The question should be, how are people hearing the voice of Jesus today? You know, because humankind has itchy ears. How are they listening to it? We know that Jesus has a life-giving voice. We know this from the scriptures. He has already proclaimed it in John chapter 5, verse 25. He said, truly, I tell you, the hour is coming and is now here when the dead will hear the voice of the Son of God, and those who hear will live. See, our Lord has a life-giving voice. The dead will live. But all that, my dear friends, is ours only if our voice recognition has been turned on. So today, make sure you've tuned in to Jesus. I want to thank you for joining me on this Saturday. God bless you all. Don't forget to like this video, share it with your friends. And I want to say thank you to all of you in a very, very special way for your love and affection for our home in Nuve, our children's home, the Love Joy Hope Foundation, run by Lenny and Nadia Soares. I want to tell you that we are identified the second home for girls. It costs about 1.25 lakhs, the house. We, I'm told, are about 21 lakh short in terms of purchasing. We have funds, money that you've given us to this foundation. We had a trustees meeting and there is about 21 lakhs short in order to pay for this second house, which is a home especially for girls. The first home will be a home for boys. The second home will be a home for girls. Remember that we do come under the CWC, that's the Child and Women's Commission in Goa. So we have government permission. It's you get an ATG facility. So if you want to help us out, and I'm really making an appeal here, if you do want to help us out, please get in touch with me. My number is 98202 42151. I will give you the contact directly of Lenny and Nadia of the foundation, so you can contact them. The money goes directly into that account, and you can specify that this is for this particular project. We are heading there. We had a meeting, we discussed this is what we would like to do, but we could also see that there is a shortfall in that amount. We have, thanks to all your donations, we have been very prudent with our spending, and we have had that amount that we've set aside. Now we just need, the person selling us the place is also willing to stagger a bit the payment, but we would like to just settle it. So with your help, I hope this reaches out to all of you and you reach out and help us. Thank you, everybody. God bless you. I'll get back to you if you ever want any details. I'll give you the numbers of the foundation, and visit the home. I think you need to visit the home. Go visit the home, see the work that we do with these children. It's amazing because it's not an orphanage, it's a children's home, and the children get a fantastic chance to become beautiful children. I know as of now, I think they are 13 because the government was going to send us one more child. Hopefully that child is coming. Yeah, God bless you all. Keep well.